Hey Ben.
What's up, Joe? We're just about ready to go. Everything's recording. So, just to jump in, I'm a South African. I don't know much about Virginia and I don't know much about Brunswick stew.
Brunswick stew is a traditional stew that's been cooked in Virginia for about 350 years. It started as a frontier stew in colonial times, where farmers would plant their fields, and the fields would eventually be attacked by swarms of voracious squirrels. And so farmers, in an attempt to protect their crops, started bringing in hunters to kill the squirrels. And the way they repaid the hunters is by giving the hunters a feast. So they would cook the squirrels, and they would make these big pots of squirrel stew and squirrel soup. And eventually, sometime in the early 1800s, the stew became known as Brunswick stew, named after Brunswick County, Virginia. Around the time of the Civil War, certainly after the end of the Civil War, Brunswick stew began to spread throughout the South. And it's one of the most famous, one of the most delicious Southern stews you can find today.
So, sorry, just correct me if I misunderstood you, but are you saying that this is squirrel stew?
Originally, it was squirrel stew, but as the frontier regions became urban regions and then became towns and cities, there were fewer and fewer squirrels. So people started substituting squirrel meat with chicken and veal and lamb and beef.
Okay, cool, got it. Okay, so what is the kind of personal origin that you had in terms of coming to write this book?
My background for writing this book is basically being a native born Virginian and living here my whole life. So I felt that it would be important to write a book about some traditional Virginian foods so that other people now and generations to come will have a record. So I'm not a historian, but I am a history buff, and I'm driven to find the details of these traditional Virginia foods like hoe cake, Brunswick stew, and in fact, Southern barbecue was born here in Virginia and spread from Virginia. And I've got another book about that called Virginia Barbecue: A History. And I'll show how it has roots in Native American cookery, African cookery, European cookery, and how all of those types of cookery were combined into producing this iconic dish we call Brunswick stew. So, what is it about Virginia that's so unique? Well, first of all, Virginia was the first successful English colony in North America. And so, what happened in Virginia is that is where specifically English colonists learn how to live in the New World. When in Rome, do as the Romans. When in Senecomica, which is what the Powhatan Indians called the eastern part of Virginia, the English are like, when in Senecomica, do as the Powhatans. They grew tobacco and corn and beans exactly like Powhatan Indians grew them. They began cooking barbecue exactly like Powhatan Indians, but they put their English seasonings in them. That being the case, what Virginians were doing became a model for how to survive in the New World. And eventually, the combination of butter beans, tomatoes, and corn became known as the Virginia Trinity. And so it just so happens that the Virginia Trinity are three key ingredients in Brunswick stew. And so that's what kind of makes Virginia unique. Um, I think that the larger issues beyond food, politics, architecture, culture, I think that the reason that I have had to delve into those things is simply because the answers that I'm seeking are very complicated, and I still have questions that I don't have answers to. But I think that when you look at the history of Chesapeake, Virginia specifically, which has been studied intensively over the last, at least for a long time, but especially over the last 30 to 40 years, there was just something happening there between these three main cultures that came, the Powhatan Indians that were already in Virginia, and then the Europeans that came, and then the Africans and the people of African descent that they brought with them here. And I don't think that you can understand our food traditions unless you understand each of those groups and the way that they influence those food traditions. And then when you start talking about culture, and you start talking about architecture and those kinds of things, um, in Virginia, colonial Virginians created the political barbecue. And that was just basically a way of bringing people together to talk to them about something important. It's how leaders, or people who wanted to be leaders, brought the common people together. Well, that is exactly how Powhatan chiefs would do with their tribes, with members of their tribes. And so to try to get the answers that I'm looking for, I've had to look into a broad array of subjects.
Is there a confirmed? I mean, this seems like it's 200 or 300-year-old meal. Is there a confirmed canon of what the recipe is, or is it still up for grabs a little bit?
Well, Brunswick stew has, at least after the Civil War, beginning after the end of the Civil War, has become a fairly controversial dish. And it turns out that Brunswick, North Carolina, has claimed to be the birthplace of Brunswick stew. Brunswick, Georgia, has claimed to be the birthplace of Brunswick stew. Brunswick, Virginia, has claimed to be the birthplace of Brunswick stew. It's such a popular dish that I guess everybody wants to claim it. But what I do in my book is I go through literally hundreds of sources to track down the real source of where Brunswick stew came from. So in Virginia, there's a fairly strict recipe for Brunswick stew. When you get down to Georgia, you get into North Carolina, they throw anything in a pot and call it Brunswick stew. But in Virginia, we're like, that's not Brunswick stew. I don't know what they're cooking, but it's not Brunswick stew.
Have you ever tried squirrel-based stew? Do people still make that?
Oh, yes, indeed. Now it's against the law to sell it because you can't sell game, and that kind of thing. But oh yes. Now I don't eat squirrels that I see roaming in my yard, right? Because God knows what they're eating. But we do squirrel hunt, and we go out in the deep forest where squirrels are eating acorns and pine cones and hickory nuts. And there's, a lot of people kind of turn their nose up at squirrel meat, but I tell you, when squirrel is properly prepared and cooked, it is really quite delicious. It really is. Um, but generally nowadays, when I make stew, I make it with chicken because I'm serving it to modern Virginians that aren't used to our hunting traditions.
Okay.
My Virginia barbecue book has about 800 primary source citations. Now, that is a lot of reading. My Brunswick stew book has about 450, 500 primary secondary source citations. Now, beyond that, no one in Virginia that's cooking real authentic Virginia style barbecue would tell me their recipes. That's where my experimentation came in. I had to try to reverse engineer a lot of these recipes. The recipes that I have in my books, you cannot Google those recipes and find them on the internet because the barbecue sauce recipes and the other things, that's just not how people cook nowadays. There's a system to making barbecue sauce nowadays that's all over the internet. 100 years ago, no one made barbecue sauce the way they do today. So not only did I have to learn to cook, it took me a few years to figure out I've got to learn how they cooked 125, 150 years ago. People all over the South are passionate about their version of Brunswick stew and barbecue. And I knew that once you step into the world of barbecue and Brunswick stew, you're kind of stepping into a very controversial world, right? In Virginia, there are 4 things you don't talk about at the dinner table, right? Politics, religion, barbecue, and Brunswick stew. And it's just the exact same recipes that just go back generations. And that was just fascinating to me. So,
Well, that's pretty much all I had to ask you, Joe. It's really great chatting, but is there anything specific you wanted to mention? Anything you kind of wanted to still chat about?
yeah, I think we've covered it all. The only thing, the only thing that I could add is that I am humbled, delighted, and surprised at how well these books have been accepted by the academic community. All right, I have 20 years in higher ed, right? And I have a lot of friends in higher ed, and a lot of them are real historians, unlike me, who's just kind of a history buff, and some of them are anthropologists and archaeologists. And I have been really, really delighted and just humbled and gratified at how they've some of these people that I know have really um, embraced these books. I'm just really gratified that there are a lot of people who are getting a lot of joy out of reading these books, and that's just very gratifying, and makes me feel really happy that I wrote them.